My name is Muñoz Martinez, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of American Studies here at Brown University. And I'm also a public humanities fellow at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities here at Brown. And I thought it was really remarkable, actually, to end the last session with a really urgent call to question who we think about when we're calling on cultural institutions and universities to provide resources and to provide programming that serves broader publics. And here at Brown and at the Center for Public Humanities, the students in the program, in the master's program, the faculty fellows and the community fellows at the center are always critically engaging with what we mean by publics, and recognizing that there's a need for cultural institutions to bring in marginalized communities that haven't been seen as their primary target audience. But even within that, when we're thinking about vernacular histories and community memories, that there is a wide range of contested memories that happen at the local level. And so in thinking about serving broader publics, I want to honor the question of what cultural institutions are doing to think critically about what they mean by public audiences and how that should change for different topics of study. We also heard in previous presentations an urge for new modes of storytelling and for ethical ways of representing histories of slavery to broader audiences. And so this panel is ideal for thinking about new methods for exploring how digital history projects fit into the efforts to bring about broader public understandings of slavery and its aftermath. Some of the questions that our panelists will be thinking through is, what does digital history contribute to the academic discipline of history? What can it add? What can't it do? How do your digital projects enhance both scholarship and teaching about slavery, the slave trade, and abolition? And how can visualizations of historical topics address broad historical questions about slavery and its legacies? One of the productive tensions underlying these presentations is really that questions about ethics for representing histories of slavery, even within the field of history, continue to be unresolved. There are discussions and debates about what are the best modes, what are the limits, what are the protocols. And we can call on the scholars in this room, but also others that have helped to advance these questions, like Sadia Hartman and Jacqueline Goldsby and Kadada Williams, that ask us to think about avoiding sensational depictions of violence, that draw our attention to the long aftermath of violence and its long legacies. In the digital public humanities, fundamental questions remain also about the limits and possibilities created when history and the digital humanities converge. The protocols and ethics for digital histories of slavery, genocide, and intersectional forms of violence more broadly are new and being developed. And the digital public humanities itself is a space where questions about the archive, public presentation, methods of storytelling, curation, design, and making histories available to multiple public projects converge. And one of the things that I think is so exciting about digital projects is that it asks us to think about user testing, something we can draw from computer science that asks academics to consider, what does it mean to be accountable to the public? To ask, what is the public taking from our projects? And how the field of the academy would actually be different if we centered not just peer evaluations, peer reviews, but actually public evaluations and user assessments of our projects. Our panelists today are Vincent Brown is the Charles Warren Professor of American History, Professor of African and African American Studies, and the Director of History Design Studio at Harvard University. His research, writing, teaching, and other creative endeavors are focused on the political dimensions of cultural practice in the African diaspora, with a particular emphasis on the early modern Atlantic world. He's a recipient of a number of awards for both his documentary work and for his digital work and for his publications. Just to give you a few, he is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and also of a Mellon New Directions Fellowship. He is the principal investigator and curator for the animated thematic map Slave Revolt in Jamaica, 1760 to 1761, a cartographic narrative. And he was a producer and director of research for the television documentary Herscovitz's At the Heart of Blackness, the recipient of the 2009 John O'Connor Film Award from the American Historical Association, and awarded the Best Documentary at both the 2009 Hollywood Black Film Festival and the 2009 Martha's Vineyard African American Film Festival. And it was also broadcast in the PBS series Independent Lens. His first book, The Reaper's Garden, Death and the Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, was co-winner of the 2009 Merle Curdy Award and received the 2009 James A. Raleigh Prize and the 2008-2009 Louis Gottschalk Prize. Our second presenter, Bill Rankin, comes to us. He took the train just parallel to the 95 Interstate. He's a historian of science at Yale. He is the author of After the Map, Cartography, Navigation, and the Transformation of Territory in the 20th Century. In addition to historical research, Bill is also an active cartographer, and his maps have been published and exhibited around the world. And most of his mapping work is available on his website, radicalcartography.net. Joseph Yannielli studies the history of slavery and abolition with a special focus on American, West African, and a wider world during the 19th century. Other areas of interest include political and social movements, missionaries and religion, capitalism and globalization, and the United States and the world. He's currently completing a book about the Mendi Mission and the role of Africa in the American abolition of slavery. Established in the wake of the Amistad Revolt, the mission was a transatlantic extension of the Underground Railroad and a key site of action and imagination in the global context over chattel slavery. His digital humanities interests and expertise range widely but center on archives, databases, and content management, media encoding and delivery, equity and open access, and digital pedagogy. So this cutting-edge work is really helping us to think through what are the possibilities for telling histories of slavery in digital forms, and helping those projects to ask us then to reevaluate our own practices of narrating in traditional disciplinary academic work, to reimagine our academic projects to serve not just academic, but also public audiences. So please help me welcome to the stage our first presenter, Vincent Brown, who will take the stage. After the three presenters present, we'll have a 15-minute conversation amongst the panelists, and then we'll open up for a conversation, and we'll look forward to your questions and answers. Thanks.
So we just need to get to the PowerPoint. Yep. Good afternoon. What a fantastic conference. I want to thank everybody who's come, the organizers of the conference, of course, and my fellow panelists, but already I've learned so much just today. I'm looking forward to our discussion this afternoon. I am especially encouraged by the way that our discussions have been drawing our attention to the rhetorical forms history takes and the way that shapes general knowledge of the past. This afternoon, I would like to discuss two graphic histories, a cartographic narrative of the Jamaican slave revolt of 1760 to 61, the one Monica mentioned, and a web-based archive of enslaved family lineages in Jamaica and Virginia that both aspire to chart new pathways for pondering history's most painful subjects and to invite reconsideration of how history has been, could be, and should be represented. The convergence of representational media, facilitated by the nearly ubiquitous profusion of computers, presents challenges and opportunities to customary ways of working. New media enable text, oration, graphics, objects, and even embodied performance to supplement or to constitute entirely new forms of scholarly and artistic production. Historical scholarship can now include open-ended and multiform engagements, interactive and continually updating databases, cartographic applications that enrich places with historical information, online dialogues with peers and the public, in addition to films and television programs, audio shows, and public performances. My own work in this area has been inspired by scholars who have consistently worked around the predominant representations of the slave trade and slavery, tightly packed as they are with dull statistics, and towards some new, more evocative logic that might restore our sense of human experience to something so historically commonplace and yet so deeply alien to our common sense as the social relations of slavery. This is a special concern of my own as a historian with a stubborn interest in exploring and telling history from below. Historians are increasingly aware that the late dramatic expansion of computing power allows for the evaluation of great amounts of data, in which previously obscured patterns may now be observed, queried, interpreted, and dynamically displayed in graphics that illustrate some of the evolving contours of social life. When animated by time-based media, or laid out within temporal diagrams, such graphics can condense analytical storytelling in the form of data visualizations, setting seemingly static images in motion as historical processes are seen to unfold. This animated thematic map narrates the spatial history of the Jamaican slave revolt of 1760 to 61, the greatest in the 18th century British Empire. To teachers and researchers, the presentation offers a carefully curated archive of key documentary evidence. To all viewers, the map suggests an argument about the strategies of the rebels and the tactics of counterinsurgency, about the importance of the landscape to the course of the uprising, and about the difficulty of mapping such events with available sources. Although this cartographic narration cannot be taken as an exhaustive database or story of any kind, the map does offer an illuminating interpretation of the military campaign's spatial dynamics. Now, there are obvious limitations to plotting a turbulent slave revolt on a map like this. By using British maps that highlight the placement of forts, towns, and estates, our maps tend to reify colonial geography. Even more fundamentally, cartography itself presumes the natural existence of points on a grid, much as history naturalizes the timeline, though both of these are ultimately folkways for representing space and time that have more in common with slaveholders' epistemes than with those of their slaves. The spatial schemas of the rebels, their landmarks and pathways, and their sense of temporality are probably irretrievable in cartographic form. Moreover, maps orient viewers by offering an orderly aerial view. But gazing down from above makes it hard to see chaos and confusion, the most essential features of a protracted insurgency. Of course, if this limitation arises from the sources, it also reflects the nature of guerrilla warfare itself. Uncertainty was, after all, the rebels' best weapon. So if the map draws a clearer picture of the extent and contours of the insurrection, it cannot convey the ambition, desperation, shock, dread, cruelty, bloodlust, and sheer mayhem of the experience. These are matters left to the historical imagination of viewers and readers. Produced by History Design Studio, Two Plantations, Enslaved Families in Jamaica and Virginia, diagrams a database of enslaved life histories compiled by the historian Richard S. Dunn. For decades, Dunn pored over the annual inventory lists of Mesopotamia Estate in Jamaica, produced between 1762 and 1833, and Mount Airy Plantation in Virginia from 1808 to 1865, piecing together a portrait of life and labor on the two plantations. In crumbling account books and fragile scraps of paper, Dunn found the names of more than 2,000 men, women, and children listed alongside the mules and cattle and pigs. With painstaking care, he reconstructed family lineages through 4 or 5 generations for as many of the people as he could. And our website displays his results for 431 enslaved people in 7 multi-generational families. And this is our interface here. The inventories themselves, the sources of his investigation, exposed only the barest traces of enslaved existence. But by interpreting such records against the grain, the website's simple family diagrams and biographical sketches highlight personhood, connection, and belonging rather than proprietary accounting. The site raises questions about the history of slavery, to be sure, but also about its interpretation. We seldom see genealogical charts for families who put down few roots. Their very scarcity suggests that perhaps the interface implicitly raises a more basic question. Are family trees even a proper way to diagram enslaved families? Family trees, of course, have inherent constraints. After all, genealogical charts were conceived to mark the succession of royalty and the inheritance of property. Don't we need a wholly new kind of diagram for families who were property, who were routinely violated and interfered with, whose lines of descent are so broken and tenuous, and whose resulting structures of kinship could never be based solely on blood relations? Such thorny questions, I think, are more valuable than easy answers. For despite the challenges of viewing slave life through plantation data in ill-fitting graphic forms, the more we try, the more we may discover. Now, these projects have compelled me to think fairly deeply about the possibilities of the digital humanities for the kind of history that interests me. Those of us working on subaltern populations rarely have the kind of big databases that inspire projects in text mining, topic modeling, or network analysis. And our data are debased, compiled from the records of the slavers, the racists, the exploiters, and their bureaucrats. Yet there may be a virtue to this limitation. We can never confuse our sources for the things they describe, and this encourages us to emphasize their qualitative nature. Without big numbers to crunch, scholars must exploit the potential of digital tools to craft scholarly designs that appreciate the interdependency of interpretive knowledge and aesthetic expression. The constraints of the archive thus compel more careful attention to the form and function, the design, of our scholarly works. Design can soften the tension between the quantitative approaches of social science, the interpretive bent of the humanities, and the creative imperatives of the arts. For such a synthesis to occur, historians will have to think more carefully about the creative choices that go into the representation of our sources, and about the aesthetics of change over time. Scholarly design can also function as a method for generating questions about the most appropriate graphic vocabulary for the phenomena under investigation, and about how we see relationships and interactions in space and time. Thinking through the formal properties of illustration, it turns out, is also a means of research. Now, projects like this also cannot help but have some effect on what slavery and its legacies mean to us. In thinking about the roots and reproduction of racial tension, we might take more time to ponder the popular revolts of the oppressed or research on enslaved families, for we have inherited their struggles and their losses. These graphical histories of slavery direct our attention to the processes of exploitation and domination that lay at the foundations of African American, but more broadly, American and Atlantic history. As a long list of scholars has shown, slavery helped to build modern capitalism, which still feeds upon war, dislocation, and the distortion of intimate relations. Using the technological fruits of late capitalism to interpret slavery across multiple media platforms cannot help but to remind people that the history of slavery continues to shape our present. And in this sense, I hope designs like these can find a humble role to play in a continuous struggle for justice, now more than 4 centuries old.
All right. So I want to start by thanking Michelle Zaks and David Blight for inviting me here. Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to share my work. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So as you already know, I am not here as a historian of slavery. I'm a historian of science. My main focus is on the history of mapping and the environmental sciences, mostly in the 20th century. But for the last 10 or 15 years, I've also been making maps, and I live something of a second life as a cartographer. I have a website, radicalcartography.net. My work has been published and exhibited everywhere from National Geographic and The Economist to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. My research and my mapping mostly intersect around methodological questions of spatial history and the digital humanities rather than any particular topic. And this means that I'm here really as much to learn from all of you as specialists in the history of slavery as I am to talk about my own work. Today I'm going to briefly show 3 projects that I've published online in the last year or so. One is about slavery in the United States as a whole, one is about slavery just in the North, and one is on slave insurance. I'll then conclude by zooming out to think about how mapping and visualization exist at the boundary between academic research, teaching, and public history. And what I want to suggest is that the potential of mapping is only partially about new kinds of digital or spatial scholarship. Just as important is the potential of producing a visual scholarship, one that is simultaneously rigorous and accessible. So let me turn to the first project, which is a series of maps from the late 18th century to the Civil War. So starting just with this is the map for 1860. And you probably can't read it. On the top, though, it explains what's going on here. The basic idea is that there's a grid here of small dots, each of which shows the population in a 250 square mile area. The size of the dot shows the number of people. The color shows the percent that were slaves. So this technique here, this regular grid of colored dots, is one that I'm mostly building from the ground up. Requires a certain amount of fancy footwork and number crunching in GIS. But we end up seeing some familiar features. So we see, obviously, the cotton-producing areas of the Mississippi Delta, the crescent of the Blackland Prairie stretching into Alabama. We see the rice-producing coast of the Sea Islands in Georgia and South Carolina. We see the areas for hemp and tobacco in Virginia and Kentucky. We also see the sort of important port towns, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, that have proportionally fewer slaves than the surrounding rural areas. Then the overall series uses these same graphics for each census year. So we start with 1790, and we go through decade by decade to 1870. So what's going on here? What am I trying to accomplish? Most maps of slavery, including, for example, Abraham Lincoln's favorite map, published just at the start of the Civil War in 1861, use counties as the unit of spatial analysis. And they shade each county to show the percent of the population that was slaves. But this introduces several interpretive problems. And there's a mismatch here between what we know is true spatially and what's being communicated visually. There are three issues in particular. So the first is that cities actually disappear completely. Cities disappear into their surrounding counties. We can't see Savannah or Charleston at all. Second problem is a little bit more subtle. It's about relative versus absolute population. So this map here shows relative population, slaves as a percent of the total. Redrawing this graphic using GIS, it looks like this. But if instead we wanted to show absolute population, the number of slaves, rather than the proportion of slaves, we actually see a really different spatial pattern. It looks like that. See that? Exact same data. So you see that the center of gravity has shifted north. There's a lot less emphasis on Texas, a lot more emphasis on Kentucky and the Chesapeake Bay. So there's a question of how do you square these two interpretations of the same data. And then the third thing, we all know that the county boundaries, especially in the West, were in constant flux in the early 19th century. And it's very hard to see temporal patterns in a series of county-level maps. So my project is about developing a new visual technique that allows us to see patterns that have otherwise remained invisible. On this map, cities jump right out. We can immediately see the difference in population between the Texas coast here and the Sea Islands, even though both are shaded the same yellow color. We can also track a particular place, a particular dot, over time, regardless of changes in jurisdiction. You can even do that across many decades at once. So the immediate point here is that my maps are addressing certain specific problems of data graphics. But more broadly, the really big move is also rhetorical. We're going from a map of geographic areas, where counties are the building blocks of space, to a map of people, where the visual emphasis is on the spatial patterns of slavery, not on jurisdictional shapes. Now, a bit more quickly, I'm going to show you these two other projects. These are pointing in a similar direction, cartographically, though they're a bit more straightforward. So first is a project that looks just at slavery in the North. So this shows data for 1790. And the big move is to show data by town, again, instead of by county, which is how most maps are drawn, using circles instead of solid shapes. So here, each of these circles is a town, and the size of the circle gives the number of slaves. Or down below, we have similar graphics for the free, non-white, and free white population. Here, change over time is shown with a simple graph rather than a slideshow. I also made an interactive version of this map, so let me switch over. I can show you how that works here. So you can see that if you mouse over, you get data for each town, and you can also switch between different groups. So there's free non-white versus slaves. You can also switch between absolute and relative. So this is absolute, and you can switch it to relative. Now, the main thing to point out here, if I can get back to my thing, which I'm not sure I can. Let's see. I'm not a Mac user. I apologize. Great. OK. So the main thing to point out here analytically is that by using circles and towns rather than hard-edged counties, again, focusing on people rather than on jurisdictions, we can immediately see the alignment between high levels of slaveholding and areas originally settled by the Dutch. So here is the Wikipedia map showing areas settled by the Dutch. So we can even say that spatially there are really two kinds of northern slavery. There's the swatch stretching from Trenton through New York City to Albany, and then there's everywhere else. We can also see this in the graph, where the decline of slavery in New York and New Jersey looks very different from other northern states. The interactivity on the web, I think, reinforces some of these same conclusions, and I think also gives some nice local specificity. For example, we can find out that there were 48 slaves in Providence, compared with more than 2,000 in New York City. And finally, a quick look at slave insurance. This project is an ongoing collaboration with Michael Ralph, who is an anthropologist at NYU. So far, the maps include about 700 policies, and right now we're adding another 600 policies fresh from the archives. The finished maps are actually going to be published in January in Foreign Policy magazine, just in time for the presidential inauguration. And here we're really starting from scratch. Slave insurance has never been mapped or analyzed geographically, and we were able to find some pretty interesting regional patterns. So this is the basic overview map, which gives the location of insured slaves by company. So the two big ones here are New York Life in teal and US Life, now part of AIG, in pink. The policies we're adding now are from Baltimore Life, which are mostly clustered in Eastern Virginia. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to run through all of our various maps or really even talk about our scholarly conclusions. Instead, I want to just highlight the main visual intervention, which is about showing the data both with these kind of abstract standard circles, but also if we zoom in, you can see I've added filled these circles with the names of all of the slaves. So I'm really trying to make here a connection between the large insurance giants that we know today and the lives of these individual human beings. Now, I said I'd end by zooming out to think about how these projects sit at the intersection of academic research, teaching, and public engagement. And we can certainly see these along a spectrum. The first project is about innovating new kinds of visualization to show patterns that specialists understand, but that aren't on most maps. The last project uses relatively straightforward graphics, but is showing patterns that even scholars have never seen before. Slavery in the North is somewhere in between. But what's important here is that because the focus of my work is about aligning spatial analysis and visual argument, I'm actually making contributions to multiple domains at once. The task is not to translate research to reach a popular audience. All of the things that I'm doing, using sources in new ways, creating new data sets, showing geographic contrasts with cities, Dutch settlement, skilled labor, or just asking us to think about what geographies matter. These are absolutely scholarly questions, but they're also what a lot of non-specialists care about too. Or finally, put this another way, for me, the important comparison actually isn't between digital and non-digital work. It's between textual and visual. And I think that the power of visual work, whether it's mapping or something else, is that it's both a form of scholarship and an easily digestible format for reaching outside the academy, both at once. These kind of bite-sized projects are obviously not going to take the place of books or articles, but they can be cited and folded into traditional forms of argument quite easily. They also work great on the web, in museums, or in periodicals. So my highest hope is that we see visual work not as a space of translation between scholarly and non-scholarly, but as a shared space where multiple communities overlap. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, folks, for having me here. I feel really honored to be in this group of distinguished professors and public history practitioners and museum curators, and I feel a little overwhelmed, and maybe that I just work on, websites, and maybe my work isn't up to the same level as some of the work that you folks are doing, but the more I think about it, the more I realize that this work is deeply interrelated and that we can't have digital history without traditional history work. And you folks are fighting in the trenches. And we can't have traditional history work nowadays without a digital component. So there's a neat dialectic here, I think. So let me tell you a little bit about my work in digital history and the history of slavery. I've been doing DH work for about 5 or 6 years now, and I started with the Slavery and Abolition Portal, which I created in grad school, which was intended as a kind of entry point for researchers and students and faculty who are interested in using primary source material at Yale, but didn't necessarily know where to start. And at Yale, a place like Yale, there's so many different libraries and museums and spaces where documents can lie hidden that we felt that it was really helpful to centralize all that material, and it's grown over time, and now we have dozens of collections and hundreds of links to other websites pertaining to the history of slavery. And that led me to create a blog where I could talk about problems in digital history and potentials of doing digital history, and that in turn led me to create a site called History Leaks, which is a play on WikiLeaks, releasing rare historical documents as if they're classified information. And we focused on underrepresented groups and underrepresented material, trying to make it as broadly accessible as possible to folks all over the world. And that project in turn led me to create Runaway, Connecticut with my students when I started teaching. We decided in a class on digital history to look at runaway slave ads and to build this kind of database of runaway slaves in the state of Connecticut. We chose Connecticut because that's where I was teaching, and also because with the Connecticut Current and other newspapers, it had a pretty complete documentary record beginning in the mid-18th century and going up to the middle 19th century. So we could really trace over time how runaway population developed. And the site is unique, I think, for 2 reasons. First, it looks at runaway slaves in New England, and there aren't really any other sites out there, as far as I know, that deal with runaways in New England. And the whole concept of slavery in New England is kind of foreign to a lot of folks who think that that's something that happened in the South, right? It's not something that was part of New England. New England is where the abolitionists were. Well, turns out that's not really true. The second way that this site is different from most other sites is that it doesn't just focus on runaway slaves. It also includes runaway husbands and runaway wives and soldiers and prisoners and indentured servants or bond slaves, runaway children. So all different kinds of categories of runaways. And that was kind of controversial because there are a lot of folks out there, including some of my students, who unfortunately buy into this myth of the Irish slaves and how other groups of individuals in historical time have been enslaved, and they did so much better than African Americans. And I don't understand why black people are complaining so much about slavery when my Irish ancestors were enslaved too. So we encountered this a little bit, but we still felt that it was important to include other types of indentured servants and bond slaves, and to really look at the full spectrum of unfreedom in colonial, early national, and early republic New England. and to look at the differences between how, for example, runaway African slaves were described and runaway Irish indentured servants were described, and in a way that could sort of help to push back against this mythology of the Irish slave that kept coming up. So just to point out a few features of the site, each one of these dots represents a runaway advertisement. And we mapped them over historical maps of the state of Connecticut. And I guess I would disagree a little bit with Professor Brown about reifying colonial geographies by including these historical maps. I think in a way we're repurposing these old colonial or nationalist maps, maybe creating a counter geography or resistant geography to that narrative, and in a way kind of reclaiming them. But I don't know. There's also a timeline. So if I move forward, we can see how the populations change and how the runaways change and where they're located. If I click on one of these, for example, and this is interesting because this is in that kind of Dutch area that Professor Rankin mentioned earlier. If I click on this ad here, this is an ad for Nance. And if you read this, you'll see that among the descriptions is that it's supposed that she's dressed in men's clothes, and it will require a more close examination. So think about that for a second. This is one of the things that we keep coming across, in transcribing these ads and including them in the database is exactly, what did it mean for somebody to post an ad like this and to enlist his entire community in saying we need to inspect the gender of this person. Does their biological sex match the gender of the clothes that they're wearing? It's kind of remarkable. We came across a surprising number of these kind of cross-dressing fugitives. And to think about the implications of that was really interesting. So we came across a lot of really surprising stories. And I think working with students on this, and this was undergraduate students, was really helpful pedagogically. So nowadays I'm working on a project called Princeton and Slavery. And this is an attempt to reckon with the relationship between the University of Princeton and the institution of slavery on a local, national, and international scale. And we looked at some other projects, such as Brown and Yale, that look at the relationship between universities and slavery, and they're all really good. Most of them take the form of a PDF file or a book, and those are excellent. Harvard included some YouTube videos with their PDF file, and that's also really cool. But we wanted to do something that would be impossible to do in print. So we are including all of our primary source material alongside our exhibits and our interpretive essays, and a lot of visualizations as well, so that we can do something a little different from other schools who are looking at the relationship between universities and slavery. So just to give you a sense of what that means, if I click on primary sources here, you get an array of all these different documents. And if you go into one of our exhibits, we're calling them stories, they're short essays, you can then go in and read about some of these documents, and if you click on the document, you can go there and you can read the full document for yourself. Now, this project has been going on for a few years now. I joined it last year, and I insisted on two things. First, that we involve the project in courses on campus, and that the only way to sustain a project like this in the long term would be to incorporate it into the curriculum. And the second thing is that we incorporate student voices in the project. And one of the first things I did when I got to campus was sit down with the Black Justice League, which is a group of students in Princeton who occupied Nassau Hall, the president's office, to demand recognition and to express grievances about how people of color were being treated on the Princeton campus. So I sat down with those folks and I asked them, what do you want to see in a project like this? How can we help you and how can you help us? One of the things that these students told us was that they wanted ammunition for their struggle with the administration, and that data would be most helpful in the form of infographics and statistics that they could throw together into a kind of report and say, look at this, this is significant. So we thought about how to visualize some of this information. We ended up mapping a all of the students who attended Princeton University between about 1740 and 1865. It was about 7,000 students. It took a little while to gather all of this information, and we put it together in a heat map. And this is very basic compared to the really sophisticated GIS work that Professor Rankin and some other folks are doing, but this is a start, and you're looking at a prototype here. And if I press play, you can see over time how the student population morphs from this focus on kind of the Northeast to a focus on the South and then the Southwest. And we could see the student population at Princeton kind of following the trail of slavery as it developed in the West, and kind of following the cotton frontier into the Western United States over time, which is fascinating. And we also discovered that at several points during the 19th century, there were more Southern students, that is students from slave-holding states, enrolled at Princeton than there were Northern students. And that was really surprising. And it really did change the climate on campus, and it made Princeton really one of the most conservative anti-abolitionist schools in the North. And the region around Princeton was actually one of the only regions in the North to vote against Abraham Lincoln in 1860. So you can see this kind of developing here, all those southern states showing up. The darker colors mean more students are coming from there, but just look at the geographical range of students. And we didn't compare that, we didn't map all the students from Harvard and Yale or some other schools that were around during that time, but we feel that the students at Princeton were really cosmopolitan. And a lot of them were coming from slaveholding states. So I'm almost out of time, but that gives you a brief overview of our project. This is a beta of the site. We're hoping to release it next year. And I look forward to your comments and questions about it because we're still in the process of designing it right now. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. I'm thrilled. I can't wait. I have too many questions. I'm going to start off with a few and allow the panelists to speak amongst themselves, and then we'll open up for questions. So we'll have a quick, about 15-minute conversation trying to bring together some of the really exciting threads that are on the table for us. One of the things that I'm really thinking about are the tensions with exploring the digital world and what that means for histories of slavery in particular. What questions about centering the human and centering the lived experience of enslaved people, what that does to challenge common understandings of big data and metadata. And I'm thinking about this from really briefly from my own experience of trying to map racial violence in Texas in the early 20th century, and thinking about Texas as a space where you see the histories of genocidal colonialism and the history of slavery converge, and that the legacies of those histories converge in Texas, but also are traceable in the practices of policing in the early 20th century. And one of the first examples that I was introduced to when I thought about mapping this here at Brown is I was introduced to a global mapping of the history of cheese. And it was helpful for thinking about what visualization can do, how you can animate a map, how you can animate a history, how you can bring archives to the public. But it brought these really interesting questions about how you fill a database with metadata when they are histories of violence, when they are histories of loss. And that really pushes what we think of when we think about web development and computer science. And that's what I think the sort of urgency for the people in this room, for the scholars in this room, from the practitioners to engage in the digital humanities, because there is a need for critical studies of race and critical studies of trauma and loss within the digital humanities. And my colleagues on the panel here are really leading those efforts. So I was really happy then to see Vincent's work and have another example for thinking critically about how to map violence and loss. But it really brings to attention questions about how to visualize people in these histories when we're thinking about maps in particular, but also when we're, in some cases, having to rely on the colonial archives, on colonial records, but also making sure that we're not, that we're bringing the humanity to light when we're thinking about statistics and big data. So I would hope that each of you could speak about that quickly. And then also, I am really interested to learn more about, in your own practices of reading against the grain in these archives for your own historical scholarship work, how we teach others to do that in a digital public history project, right? So what does it mean to bring these archives of violence and make them broadly available? What kind of curation do we need to do so that people are reading them critically? And that is also where I see the important work of design and curation merging with historical narrative and practice. So first, let's think about what it means to center the human in these big data projects. What a map can do for animating some of those lived experiences, and then also, critically thinking about what it means to bring these sources to public in a meaningful and ethical way. Who wants to start?
You want to start with the big data question?
Yeah, sure. So I think that one of the real potentials that I see in web-based work, but also one of the things I think has not been pushed as far as it could be, is that you can operate at multiple kind of evidentiary scales at once. That you can have individual records of individual lives, and at the same time you can show the overall pattern. So you can have an interface that sort of gives you the pattern, and then you click through. Sometimes you just mouse over or whatever it is, and you get the data that's built from. And that's something you can't do with print publication, right? You can give both the overall pattern and the detailed analysis, detailed data at the exact same time. And I think that the thing that I think is not working in a lot of digital projects is that there is a lot of the sharing of the detailed data and not as much thought about, well, what is the overall pattern that I, as the scholar or the analyst or the curator, wants to show. I think there is this idea that if we just release tons and tons of data, then people will find their way through it, they'll come to their own conclusions, all of which is well and good, but I think there is also, I think it's incumbent upon the scholars and curators to then say, well, what do I think is in fact the interpretation that I would make of these things? And to give that at the same time as the detailed data for it, right? So it's interpretation and evidence rather than just a kind of archive dump. Mm-hmm. So I think that's addressing a couple of your questions at once, but to me that's, I think, a lot of what I'm trying to work through.
I think I want to pick up on that and maybe even push it further, perhaps in controversial directions, especially given the emphasis on the public and the sharing of scholarly information with the public as being always already a good thing, and that scholars should be always thinking in terms of of wikiing their work, right, with the public. It is absolutely true that no single scholar, no group of scholars can learn everything that's available to a broader public that knows lots of things about history, that has collected lots of things about history that individual scholars or collections of scholars can't have. It's also true that scholars have spent a lot of time thinking about these things, about what makes a legible pattern, right? About how it is that very particular bits of evidence can be fit into that larger pattern that lots of other people haven't been thinking about. So I was thinking about something that Nancy was saying in the earlier panel, that when she would go to these groups, what they wanted her as a historian to authorize things that they already knew. But that didn't mean they wanted you to, they weren't thinking in absolutely egalitarian terms. They still wanted you to authenticate what they knew, right? They actually wanted that hierarchy. They wanted you as someone who's been spending a lot of time with this material to ferret out a truth claim for them, right? That leaves us with a considerable amount of responsibility that is not just abandoned when we begin to put our work online as what Bill said is a kind of an archive dump, and just assume that every interpretation of the assembled archive is as good as any other. I know that's what's the word? That's an elitist perspective, right? But it's also a perspective that respects the work that people do to understand lots of different archives, kinds of materials, to read in the historiography, to think about the meaning of this material as it comes together, in a way that not everybody has time to do. So I would, in that way, argue for the value of expertise, and I think that it's absolutely relevant to the people that we're trying to serve. They come to us because we have that expertise, because we know something that they don't know. And I think that we're sometimes in a rush when we do public work to pretend as if we don't know anything that other people don't know.
I'd like to add to that as well. I think that we need to look at the digital as a realm that's socially constructed. It's not value neutral, and it replicates in many ways the same hierarchies and inequalities that we find in our society. And we have to kind of push back against that. So Wikipedia is really a great example because you can go on Wikipedia and find amazing, detailed, complicated articles about professional wrestlers and comic book characters that are brilliantly and elegantly written and fully documented with dozens of footnotes to scholarly material. But if you look for a feminist or if you look for something on African history, you'll find that there's not that much. And to their effort, Wikipedia is actually the Wikipedia Foundation is making a concerted effort to remedy those things by holding hackathons where folks can add underrepresented groups and ideas to the project. And I think that's what good intellectual leadership is about. If we consider ourselves intellectuals, one of the jobs of the intellectual is to lead, to point in a direction. And that doesn't mean that we can ignore the masses or the users. We can converse with them, we can engage in a dialogue with them, but we still need to lead. We need to point in a certain direction. And if folks are being underrepresented online, it's our job to stand up and say, we need to remedy this.
I wonder too in that if there's flexibility, do you see that there's flexibility working within the digital world? Considering that it takes collaboration across not just academic communities, but also across a university to work with the libraries, to work with other departments, to work with other academics, but it also is expensive and takes funds for applying for grants. And I'm thinking here about Nancy's earlier presentation about the freedom to create without having to rely on fundraising. And so, in terms of building these projects, I think that there is certainly, what I have found is it gives scholars and it gives an opportunity to think about creating public projects that are not necessarily reliant on cultural institutions. And so you can work with a museum, but if a museum says no to a permanent exhibit, you could put it online, right? And so thinking about what does the digital world open up in terms of both academic projects, but also thinking about public projects where there may be resistance at a local level, or where there may be institutional resistance within museums or other cultural institutions, thinking about the possibilities that are there, not just for bringing particular histories to light that have been ignored or marginalized, but in this specific case, about exploring new modes of storytelling to bring out histories of slavery that would otherwise be unavailable, right, if you're just moving through the archive.
So I think there are a number of things there, and I kind of like to divide the affordances of digital work, new technology work, into production, consumption, and distribution, or production, distribution, and consumption. On the production side, as Bill said, there are lots of ways in which one can take, if we want to call them data, all kinds of our sources, our data, manipulate them in various ways, represent them in various ways beyond the print medium that show different kinds of things, different kinds of aspects of our interpretation to different kinds of audiences. And then for distribution, we can put them in different places, whether it's in institutions, whether it's online, whether it's in broadcast. That is all something that allows us a greater variety in the way we can reach an audience. And then finally, the way they consume those things, the way people learn from those things, depends on what we've decided to do, how we've decided to represent that data, right? Whether it's in graphical forms of various kinds or other kinds of rhetorical conventions that we've developed to express our interpretation, that's going to shape how people know what they know. I always like to think that every kind of representation has virtues and limitations, right? So text, print, has its own virtues and limitations. Various graphical conventions you could use to represent something like a family lineage, that has its virtues and limitations. We can show connection through these genealogical charts, but we can't show all the various ways in which people make kin, actually make kin, especially in conditions like slavery, through those genealogical charts, right? They do something, they don't do other things. In respect to maps, right? Maps often presume that the Earth came ready-made with a graticule, right? with latitudes and longitudes on it in which you could place points. But that's not actually the case. That's not the way most people experience space. And as Professor Rankin can tell you in much more detail than I, that's a convention that's developed over time through history to represent space and say certain things about space, right? But we don't all experience space that way, just as we don't all experience time as moving forward on a timeline as if on a single non-varying unilinear metric moving forward, right? That's just not what happens. We can experience time retrospectively. We can experience time imminently, as in God's time, right? Time can be recursive. So all of those things that we say are genre rules for representing space and time, the map or the timeline, those don't exhaust the ways in which we might want to represent the human experience of space and time. And the graphic forms which embody those things, those maps, those timelines, those graphical charts, those don't say everything to us. And I always like to think, especially because we're working in multiple media and in multiple forms, I always like to think about what we can know, what we can learn when we do this kind of work in new various ways, given the technology that affords us these opportunities, and what is still obscured to us, and what we might need some other form to learn. What print, what text might still be better at showing, right? So for example, the things that happen inside the imagination of someone's worldview, I think novels still do that better than any of these graphical forms we might choose. So we shouldn't be kind of abandoning the old forms that do really great things for us because technology affords us some new kinds of conventions for representing things that have been harder to see before.
I would say I have two responses that are kind of a much more pragmatic flavor. One, I think things that I think my web work has really opened up for me is to engage projects at multiple scales that they don't fit with usual genre conventions. So I can have an idea for a map, and 3 hours later I can have it on my website. You can't do that with a book or an article, right? Other projects are many, many months, right? So that the ability to do that kind of bite-sized work, to me, has been really liberating, and really some of the simplest kind of just sketches of ideas have actually ones that have really kind of had the most travel. So that's one kind of a practical issue. The other is this is another of my takes on a lot of the digital that we see right now. It's really important to me in almost all the work that I've created that it's downloadable and shareable really, really easily. So like except for the interactive thing, everything else is a static graphic that you can download from my website at high resolution. So like I had the slideshow of the American slavery posted on my website. Within a couple of days, it was in a half dozen news sites around the world because it was released to Creative Commons, certain license that lets them do that. They can download the high resolution thing. They can make their own, do whatever they want with it. And that was really, really gratifying to see that there wasn't the sense of a kind of self-contained interface that couldn't be shared and couldn't be distributed. And especially when using things like Twitter or other kinds of social media things, being able to just share a punchy graphic really, really does a lot in ways that a kind of a lovingly curated interactive database can't be shared in the same sort of way.
I'll just be really quick because I want to get to your questions, but I'll just say very quickly that yes, the digital is immediate and it's exciting, and so many of our students now are what are called digital natives, right? They live in this kind of online environment, but in many ways that epistemology is not very well questioned. And we are not really teaching digital literacy at the same time as we're teaching historical literacy. And we also have to be aware of how these databases are constructed and always keep that in the foreground so that we know the limitations of our data, not just accept it as an object that's being granted to us and reify it, but constantly keep that process of interpretation in the foreground. I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, I think we have a few already. There's one here in the middle section. And thank you so much for the student volunteers who are gracefully up and down the stairs with great speed with the microphone.
Thank you. This is
It's on, yeah.
I think it's on.
I think we need what I don't see is a kind of expertise in the framing of these encounters with the material that's a pedagogical. As a scholar, I'm fascinated by this, and my imagination is sparked to raise all kinds of questions. As a curator, it seems to me that this material is not all that different from the kind of intricate artifact that often is presented to me, and somebody says, we want you to use this in your exhibition. And I look at this object and I discover all kinds of fascinating things about this piece of furniture or this piece of kitchenware. And I imagine all kinds of stories that can be told about it. And then I remember that my job is to actually lead some specific audience through a passage of time to encounter this object and many other objects and pieces of data, like the ones that you suggest, toward a kind of the visitor's capacity to construct some kind of meaning, which means I really need to add a different kind of expertise, a pedagogical expertise, and which would tell me if I'm working with a 12-year-old, I need to know what in the social and psychological impetus of that child is going to really lead to a particularly fruitful way of interacting with this particular this device. That's going to be different if I'm dealing with a group, if I'm dealing with people who are older. So most of the expertise that as a curator that I provide is actually supplementary to the artifact. It's a strange thing. I've always felt very uneasy about using the word curator because the curators are usually people who have the expertise about the furniture or the archaeological relic or whatever it is, right? So as a historian and as a pedagogue in museums, I've tried to use that information. And often, you know, the worst thing that happened as a social historian is that we would walk into a museum and they'd say, we want you to use this collection in your exhibition. And they never had stuff that we could actually use, right? So we had to figure out a way to avoid following their implications. So what I'm interested in is the idea that we would take these databases, these programs that you're developing, and subject them to a kind of experimentation with a series of different audiences in different settings, and see what sorts of inquiries they could be constructed out of it. As a scholar, I could generate all kinds of interests. What I don't see happening is a kind of appropriation of this material to a whole set of existing purposes, right? What is it that this is going to give us, that existing resource material available to us, the other artifacts? And that's what these are, fundamentally, are artifacts. So there needs to be a kind of application of a different kind of expertise, and an expertise in the pedagogical process. And it's not going to be linear. It's not just production and distribution and consumption, but rather a kind of interactive process where that kind of inquiry. As one example, we were given a task of somebody had done a virtual reality reconstruction of New Amsterdam in 1630. There was nothing that, or I guess it was 1660, it was based on the Costello map. There was no conceivable value to this that any teacher could actually use until we were able to superimpose on that amazing amount of data that had been collected an inquiry that would really satisfy the social and psychological and educational aspirations of particular groups of teachers and students. So that's what I don't hear enough of, is how do we insert this into processes that are actually real life needs. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I can only offer a partial response because I don't work with 12-year-olds. And so I don't claim that kind of pedagogical expertise. But one of the things you don't see in my presentation, but is really important to me about how I present these on my website, is to really make it clear that all of these representations are partial, and I'm not making a claim that this is the only way to understand this phenomenon. So you saw a little of that when I'm comparing my map of slavery to the Hergesheimer map from 1861, and really making it clear how to understand why representation matters. and how different forms of representation can lead to very different interpretations. So a lot of the way that I understand the work that I'm doing and the way that I share it and make sense of it, explain it to other audiences, is as a way of trying to make it clear that representations can be multiple, and that there's a way of divorcing the representation, which is interpretive, from the data, which someone else could take and use in a different way, right? So again, it's only a partial response, but I think there is something about the ability to put the kinds of artifacts that we've all seen on this panel into conversation with other ways of showing the same kinds of history, and opening up a conversation about why this way of showing history opens up different interpretations than more traditional forms.
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay. Let's check two. One, Vincent, regarding the family tree and showing the African Americans and the master slave relationships. I would love to be sure. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm trying to shout. So my question, first one, is for Vincent around the family trees, or how do you show master slave relationships? You said right now the way the genealogical charts are, those don't actually work very well. I agree with you on that. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. The second question that I have for the group as a whole is, as I look at the genealogists, you guys uncover all this information as scholars, how do you get that information to the public? How do you get that information to the public? So, for example, if Brown has a website, Yale has a website, Princeton has a website, why are we not collectively creating one database where I can go, as someone who's not an academic, but a genealogist and interested in what I can have, and search for that information by the owner or my ancestor? And then why is that could be a database for the public, right? So we're talking about reaching the public. And the other part of that is that there's so many people, even in this room, that come to me and say, I have documents related to slavery. My ancestors owned slaves. I don't know what to do with those. There's no place for them to post those today. I think that's a huge gap, and I think that's where the academic world and scholars come in. So that's just fine.
Yeah. So your question was about the family tree as a graphic form for representing genealogy, its virtues and limitations. So what we did with that site was to say, look, you can read these sources, right, these inventories, in a radically different way than they're normally read. You can read them for connection, right? And you can read them for a struggle to form familial connections over time. So we've got 7 multi-generational families represented. For 430 people or so, Richard Dunn has found 2,000 individuals in these lists that he's tried to stitch together. He worked over 40 years doing this. Nobody's going to do that work again, frankly. And most people don't want to spend the time or will have the resources to do that kind of work. Finally, he's connected up the people that were in Virginia, traded to Alabama. He's connected up many of their families to the 1870 census. And as you'll know, the 1870 census is kind of ground zero for African American genealogy, because it's the first singular place where African Americans are listed by name with their families instead of on these individual inventories. In the course of making these websites for Richard Dunn to represent the family tree that I showed you, his hand-drawn family trees, we thought we might be able to reconceive enslaved families, right, using this data. And it turned out that the graphic form of the family tree was too strong. The web designers we were working with didn't really understand the ideas we had for recreating a new kind of family structure with this data. And also, the data themselves, right, were incorporated already into Dunn's conception of what a family was, into the family tree. So that convention itself was too hard to break. We couldn't just kind of take that data that was already drawn into that picture, explode the picture, and come up with something brand new, right? But having done that, I think we were able to find the edges, find the parameters of the graphic form of the family tree and its insufficiencies for representing these kinds of families. So that itself became a kind of research question for us. What would be the new way of representing enslaved families that would be truer to the experience of connection and kinship and belonging among enslaved families? To me, that's a significant question for historians, but also for graphic designers. And, you know, in my practice as a historian, like, it's just as important to me to ask questions and to frame questions correctly than it is to be able to answer them. I'll leave it to the web designers to talk a little bit more about the singularity and whether or not we're ever going to have
I only have a very brief response to that. I'm sure there's institutional dynamics that I will never understand, making that kind of collaboration difficult or impossible. But I would say that we actually have something like a universal archive with the right kind of search engines, right? So, like I'm the genealogist for my family, and I have a bunch of stuff that I put on the web, and people find it all the time. And they contact me, and it's there to take and share. So the thing I would say is that both for individuals like myself, but also for large institutions, whether it's Princeton, Yale, or some small historical society, make sure that your stuff is on the web and searchable, right? Make sure people can find it, that it's indexed properly, that it's easy to download. You can download it all at once instead of clicking 1,000 times on each document, whatever it is. But I think that having a distributed sense of accessibility is still quite robust.
I think we have time for one more question. Unless there's two hands, and then maybe we can ask you to both ask your question, then we'll try to respond simultaneously. Down here.
Yeah, this probably goes to Vincent a little bit. I appreciate your plea for the expert. I agree with you totally. But one of the things I wonder is to what extent and in what ways is the digital refiguring our responsibility as intellectuals, as curators. So there must be something in the digital age that forces us to change. And I'd like to know what does expertise mean in terms of the new digital age?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. That's a kind of perfect reframing, and I think we can take it back a little bit to the question that Richard Benowitz was asking about kind of how we think of how audiences are encountering our work through that. So for me, the question of I think of myself not as a cartographer, not as a web producer or web maker, but more as a history producer. And the model for me is really like the film producer or like the museum curator, who has to learn, right, using the technological media that are afforded, how to collaborate with various people who have lots of different kinds of expertise, right? So I can't do these cartographic projects on my own. I need to hire someone like Bill and hire someone else who can do the website. But what I can think about is, what are the best ways of reading these sources? What are the best ways of discerning patterns within these sources that I know? How do I read them in terms of the questions that historians and other people in a community of interpretation have been asking about these? And that may include the public as well, right? But I have training in thinking about how it is that one reads historical sources, thinks about them in the present, and represents them in one way or another to an audience of students, an audience in a broad public. Whether I have the technological skills, right, the design skills to manifest that project perfectly? No. And that's where my skill as a producer in collaborating with various people comes to bear, right? So I'll bring a cartographer in, I may bring a cinematographer in, I don't know, I may bring, a curator in, and think together about how it is that people are going to best encounter my interpretation as producer of this historical material. The digital has allowed us, right, to work between media much more quickly than we could have before, right? And that's, I think, why it's a handy and useful tool to me. I don't think of digital history or digital humanities as a distinct field from just being a humanities scholar or being a historian. I think of the digital as offering a set of tools through which I can ask these questions I've been asking for a very long time in slightly different ways and come up with slightly different answers, right? Depending on what, again, the virtues and limitations of the media are, and the skill sets of the people that I'm collaborating with.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I will say, there was one more question. Sorry, we're going to have to talk about that outside, or if you, real quick, shout it out.
Quick, it's quick.
Quick.
Okay, I even wrote it down being fast. Okay. So there are more historic houses and small museums in this country than there are Smithsonians and major historical institutions like Ivy League schools like Brown. We small sites are the front line in the war for public memory. And yet we are often ill-equipped for the work that we do due to low funding and resources. Are any of you, and this is actually for most of the room I'm asking, are any of you collaborating with these small museums, these small historic houses? Why not? How can you help us?
Yes.
Because you all have a lot of the scholarship.
Yes.
We might have a lot of the community resources. How can you help us?
So yes is the answer. I get email all the time from these small places saying, can we use your graphics for XYZ? And I say yes. That's my main way of doing it.
I will be asking you that same question very soon.
Yeah, and then sometimes they say, can I get it at a higher resolution for a poster? I say yes. Sometimes they say, can you do lots of extra work for me? And I have to say no. But no, I think a lot. But I definitely have. I charge licensing for commercial work. I don't charge anything for nonprofit work. So I think of that as one of the main ways that I try to do that. Yeah.
At Princeton Slavery Project, I'll just say very quickly, we're working with a lot of community partners, especially in New Jersey, local history museums and so forth, and trying to support their work and getting their perspective on our project as well. And there's also a really great project called the History Harvest that you should look up, where folks are kind of crowdsourcing community cultural objects and working in collaboration with community partners to build digital objects. So that's really cool, and there's lots of really great grassroots programs going on out there.
Yes. And I'll also say, too, that in my own work, the effort to map these different events of racial violence in Texas really came out of local calls by residents for the state of Texas to recognize these. It's the role of state police and local police in committing acts of extralegal violence and participating in lynchings. And the process of getting state historical markers has been taking years, and we've only received approval for 4. And so this map is an opportunity to partner with local counties that have a wealth of sources that just need to be digitized and that need to be available to the public. And it's really filling a gap. But I also, in some ways, some of what is so exciting about these mapping projects is not necessarily the cool technology, but the research questions themselves, the questions that they're asking of the archives. And one of the most valuable sources for me in terms of teaching visualizing histories of violence is the NAACP map of lynchings from the 1880s to the 1930s, right? It is pencilly drawn, a state by state account of how many lynchings are happening across the country. And some states are black, and some states have X's, but the practices of lynchings are across the country. And that is so sophisticated in conveying information quickly to students, to the public. And what we're thinking about is the new ways for using these new technologies to do that. When we have exciting questions about archives, when we want new patterns to emerge, how we can use web development and design to help amplify our findings and make them available to wider public. So in some cases, you can draw a map too. and use your own squiggles to convey information. So thank you so much to the panelists. All of your projects have inspired me.